A young man, Ethan Vance, is reported missing for several weeks from the desert town of Havenwood, Arizona. Then, a resident, Mr. Alastair Finch, wanting to clean his stubbornly clogged rooftop water cistern, is shocked to find Ethan's body inside. The relentless Arizona sun beat down on the small, sun-baked desert town of Havenwood, baking the cracked adobe walls of its single-story homes and making the air shimmer in visible, heat-laden waves above the faded asphalt of its sparsely populated streets. But for the Vance family, residents of a modest, neatly kept ranch house on the quiet cul-de-sac of Acacia Drive, the past 3 weeks had been an entirely different landscape, one of cold, gnawing, ever-present fear, a stark, chilling contrast to the oppressive, inescapable external heat. Ethan, their bright, restless, and often infuriatingly independent 19-year-old son, a young man on the very cusp of defining his own path in life, had vanished into the deepening, purple-hued desert twilight like a wisp of smoke, like a mirage dissolving under the harsh desert gaze. He had left behind only an empty, unnervingly tidy bedroom, a half-eaten tuna sandwich, and an open art history textbook on his worn wooden desk, and a deafening, echoing silence that grew heavier, more ominous, and more unbearable with each unanswered, increasingly desperate call to his cell phone. Each fruitless, exhausting search party that returned with slumped shoulders, dust-caked boots, and downcast, sorrowful eyes. Hope, initially a defiant, crackling blaze fueled by the fierce intensity of parental love and the genuine outpouring support of their small, tight-knit community, had dwindled over those agonizing 21 days to a fragile, sputtering, almost invisible ember, constantly threatened by the vast, indifferent, often treacherous expanse of the Sonoran Desert that surrounded Havenwood on all sides, and by the equally barren, desolate, and unforgiving landscape of official leads and tangible clues. Ethan Vance was a whirlwind of raw, untamed youthful energy and burgeoning artistic ambition. He dreamt, often aloud and with passionate conviction, of escaping Havenwood's dusty, sun-bleached confines, of attending a prestigious art school in a distant, vibrant, rain-soaked city like Portland or Seattle, a place where, he imagined, his unique vision would be understood and nurtured. His numerous sketchbooks, always tucked under his arm or stuffed into his worn backpack, were filled with vibrant, often surreal, charcoal and pastel landscapes inspired by the stark, paradoxical beauty and hidden, subtle dangers of his desert home. Towering saguaros depicted as ancient, silent sentinels, coyotes with knowing, almost human eyes, and abstract patterns that mirrored the cracked earth and the shifting desert sands. He was known throughout Havenwood for his quick, sometimes sarcastic wit, his mop of unruly dark brown hair that constantly, stubbornly fell into his intense, piercing green eyes, and a sometimes reckless, almost cavalier impulsiveness that often landed him in minor, easily forgiven scrapes, a missed curfew, a speeding ticket on a deserted stretch of highway, but never, his parents insisted with fierce loyalty, any serious or malicious trouble. He worked part-time, somewhat erratically, at Desert Blooms, the local nursery owned by the kindly Mrs. Henderson, watering heat-stressed plants and hauling bags of soil. He spent nearly all his free hours exploring the rugged, sun-drenched canyons and shadowy, cool arroyos that snaked like ancient veins beyond the town limits, often accompanied only by his battered second-hand 35mm camera, perpetually seeking out the perfect, unconventional shot, the hidden angle, the fleeting moment of desert magic that others might overlook. His relationship with his parents, Carol, a warm, pragmatic nurse at the local clinic, and Mark, a quiet, thoughtful geologist who worked for a mining consultancy, was typical of a young man his age, a mixture of deep affection, occasional chafing at perceived restrictions, and a growing desire for independence. Recently, he'd been more preoccupied than usual, a subtle tension in his normally relaxed demeanor that Carol had attributed to the stress of college applications and his perennial indecision about his future. He was last seen on a Tuesday evening, just as the colossal, fiery orb of the sun began its spectacular, theatrical descent behind the distant, jagged peaks of the Coyote Mountains, painting the vast, cloudless sky in breathtaking, transient hues of molten orange, deep crimson, and soft violet. He'd poked his head into the kitchen where Carol was preparing dinner, the familiar scent of roasting chicken and herbs filling the air. He announced, with his usual casualness, that he was heading out to catch the last light near Weaver's Peak, a familiar local landmark, characterized by its distinctive, bird-like rock formation, a favorite, easily accessible haunt for local photographers, amateur hikers, and contemplative sunset watchers. He'd grabbed his worn canvas camera bag, pulled on his beat-up, trail-dusted sneakers, and filled his reusable water bottle from the kitchen tap. "Don't be too late, F," Carol had called after him, her voice a familiar, almost reflexive of maternal concern, honed by years of loving a son with a wanderer's spirit. "And watch out for snakes, it's that time of year." He just grinned, that familiar, slightly lopsided grin of his, a flash of white teeth against his suntan skin, waved a dismissive hand over his shoulder, and disappeared out the back screen door, which slammed shut behind him with a sharp, percussive sound that now echoed with a chilling, unbearable finality in her memory. When he hadn't returned by midnight, well past his usual unspoken curfew for weekday desert excursions, a small, cold frisson of unease had begun to ripple through Carol and her husband, Mark. Ethan was independent, yes, often lost in his artistic pursuits, but rarely, if ever, deliberately inconsiderate or uncommunicative. By the first pale, uncertain light of dawn, the unease had blossomed, with terrifying speed, into full-blown, heart-stopping panic. They called his cell phone repeatedly, each call going directly, ominously, to voicemail. They frantically contacted his closest friends. No one had seen him or heard from him since the previous afternoon. Together, their faces etched with a shared, unspoken dread, they drove their own pickup truck along the dusty, rutted track out to the base of Weaver's Peak, their increasingly desperate calls of his name swallowed by the vast, uncaring, profound silence of the awakening desert. His old, slightly battered red pickup truck was found parked exactly where he always left it at the trailhead, locked, with nothing obviously amiss or out of place inside. The Havenwood Sheriff's Department was immediately alerted, and soon Ethan Vance's smiling, slightly mischievous, achingly young face was staring out from hastily printed missing posters tacked onto community notice boards, dusty gas station windows, and the sun-bleached, weathered wooden walls of the local general store and post office. His sudden, inexplicable disappearance was a stark, unwelcome, terrifying intrusion into the usually placid, sun-drenched, predictable rhythm of daily life in Havenwood, Arizona. The initial police investigation into Ethan Vance's perplexing disappearance, spearheaded by Havenwood's weary but unfailingly diligent sheriff, Roy Brody, a man whose weathered face seemed to carry the weight of every unresolved sorrow in the county, and his small, overworked team of deputies, commenced with a flurry of urgent, almost frantic activity that quickly, dishearteningly, ran up against the formidable, unyielding, and often hostile realities of the Sonoran Desert. Search and rescue teams, a motley but determined mix of local deputies, sun-weathered volunteer firefighters, concerned Havenwood residents, and experienced leathery-skinned trackers from a neighboring county renowned for their almost preternatural ability to read the subtle language of the desert, fanned out across the rugged, unforgiving terrain surrounding Weaver's Peak. They battled scorching daytime temperatures that shimmered above 110 degrees, navigated treacherous, boulder-strewn ravines, and meticulously scanned the vast, scrub-dotted, seemingly endless landscape from horseback, ATVs, and on foot. Their arduous efforts hampered by the sheer, daunting scale of the search and the unforgiving, often deceptive nature of the environment. A helicopter, borrowed at considerable expense from the state police, conducted several wide sweeping flyovers, its rotors beating a hopeful rhythm against the vast blue sky, but ultimately yielded no discernible sign of a lost, injured, or stranded hiker. Interviews with Ethan's circle of friends, his family members, and his easygoing boss at the Desert Blooms nursery, Mrs. Henderson, painted a generally consistent picture of a well-adjusted, if somewhat restless and artistically inclined young man. He had no known enemies, no significant gambling or drug-related deaths, no recent serious arguments or expressed concrete desires to run away from home or Havenwood. His small, characteristically untidy bedroom at the Vance home was meticulously searched by deputies. Its contents, sketches, books, clothes, a collection of vintage cameras, carefully examined. His aging desktop computer and his more recent laptop were taken for forensic analysis. His sketchbooks pored over for any cryptic messages or unusual imagery. His sketches, as always, were filled with fantastical desert creatures, anthropomorphic cacti, and swirling abstract patterns that seemed to mimic the desert wind. His computer history, when finally accessed, showed recent searches for art school admission requirements, advanced photography techniques, online galleries of landscape photographers, and, somewhat incongruously to the investigators, but not to his parents who knew his eclectic interests, several articles about sustainable water harvesting techniques and historical desert dwelling innovations, a topic of perennial, vital concern in arid Havenwood. His phone records, once obtained after navigating the necessary legal hurdles, showed his last outgoing call was to his best friend, Jake Riley, earlier on the afternoon he disappeared. A mundane, unremarkable conversation about the possibility of meeting up later that week to work on Jake's sputtering old motorcycle. His phone had last pinged a cell tower near the base of Weaver's Peak around 6:30 p.m., approximately the time he'd told his mother he was heading out to catch the last light. After that, it had gone completely, irrevocably silent, either deliberately switched off, its battery depleted by the harsh conditions, or, as a more sinister possibility began to take root, destroyed. The small, close-knit community of Havenwood, initially galvanized by the crisis, rallied around the distraught Vance family with heartfelt sincerity. Neighbors, many of whom had watched Ethan grow from a mischievous boy into a thoughtful young man, brought over covered dishes of casseroles, homemade bread, and thermoses of hot coffee for the searchers. They offered tearful words of comfort, shared anecdotes of Ethan's kindness or his quirky humor, and helped distribute the missing person flyers to every corner of the county. A poignant, well-attended candlelight vigil was held in the small, dusty town square, the flickering, hopeful flames of dozens of candles, a fragile, luminous symbol of collective hope against the encroaching, pervasive darkness of the unknown. But as days bled into weeks with absolutely no sign of Ethan, no ransom note to suggest an abduction, no credible sightings from truckers or travelers on the nearby interstate, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift began to occur within the community. The initial wave of active communal concern began to recede, as such waves inevitably do, replaced by a hushed, uneasy fear and the unavoidable, insidious creep of local rumors and whispered speculations. Had Ethan, with his known artistic temperament and his expressed desire to see the wider world, simply decided to finally escape the perceived confines of small-town life, leaving his old life behind without a word? Had he fallen afoul of unsavory, dangerous characters, drug traffickers perhaps, or desperate migrants, rumored to frequent the more remote, unpatrolled desert areas along the border? Or had the desert itself, with its myriad hidden, impersonal dangers, abandoned, collapsing mine shafts from a bygone era, sudden violent flash floods that could turn dry arroyos into raging torrents, venomous Gila monsters, rattlesnakes, or even a fatal, disorienting heat stroke, simply, tragically, impersonally claimed him? For Carol and Mark Vance, the relentless, unending weeks of silence were an agonizing, almost unbearable living torment. Every unexpected ring of the telephone sent a violent jolt of adrenaline through their already frayed nervous systems. A desperate, sickening lurch between a desperate, irrational flicker of hope and a soul-crushing wave of dread.
They replayed their last conversations, their last fleeting interactions with Ethan, endlessly, obsessively in their minds, dissecting every word, every nuance, every gesture, searching desperately for any overlooked clue, any subtle hint of distress, any unusual intention or unspoken worry he might have inadvertently revealed. Sleep, when it came at all, offered little respite, their dreams haunted by vivid, recurring images of their son, lost, alone, perhaps injured, wandering in the vast, unforgiving, sun-scorched wilderness. The organized search parties, once robust and filled with determined volunteers, grew smaller, less frequent, their efforts yielding only more dust, more frustration, more weary despair. The initial flurry of local media attention dwindled to occasional, brief updates, their son's smiling face gradually receding from the forefront of public consciousness. The official police investigation, while still technically designated as active, inevitably began to lose its initial desperate urgency, overshadowed by the daily demands of other, more current, more actionable crises within the county. The case of Ethan Vance, despite being only a few short, agonizing weeks old, was already beginning to acquire the chilling, heart-wrenching patina of a cold case, a painful, unanswered, gaping question mark hanging heavy and oppressive over the sun-scorched, silent landscape of Havenwood. Alastair Finch was a man of ingrained routine, quiet intellectual pursuits, and a deep appreciation for the stark, minimalist beauty of the Arizona desert. A retired high school history teacher, originally from the damp, bustling Pacific Northwest, he had chosen Havenwood for its reliably dry climate, its clear night skies perfect for his amateur astronomy hobby, and the promise of a peaceful, uncomplicated solitude in his sunset years. His small, neatly kept stucco house, painted a discreet desert tan, sat on a dusty, half-acre lot on the older, less developed western edge of town, about a mile, as the crow flies, from the Vances' home on Acacia Drive, though their social orbits, separated by age, interests, and circumstance, had rarely, if ever, intersected. Mr. Finch prided himself on his admirable self-sufficiency, his well-stocked library of historical monographs, and his meticulously maintained desert garden, a surprising, carefully curated oasis of hardy, architectural succulents, vibrant, drought-resistant bougainvillea, and fragrant desert lavender. One of the less charming, more anachronistic features of his older pre-municipal water grid property, however, was its primary reliance on a large, somewhat unsightly, above-ground galvanized steel water cistern, a common, almost iconic fixture in some of Havenwood's more established outlying residences. This tank, filled periodically by a water delivery service, supplemented the often strained and sometimes unreliable municipal water supply, especially during the long, parched, relentlessly hot summer months.
For the past week or so, Mr. Finch, a man keenly attuned to the subtle rhythms and minor dysfunctions of his domestic environment, had been experiencing increasingly problematic and decidedly annoying issues with his household water pressure. First, it was a sputtering, hesitant faucet in the kitchen sink. Then, a shower that dwindled from a robust spray to a frustrating, lukewarm trickle, making his morning ablutions a test of patience. By Saturday morning, nearly 4 long, agonizing weeks after young Ethan Vance had inexplicably vanished from the other side of town, the water flow from all of Mr. Finch's taps had ceased altogether, replaced by a dispiriting, hollow gurgle. The cistern, he deduced with a weary sigh of resigned annoyance and a mental calculation of the impending inconvenience and expense, must be severely clogged at its outflow pipe. Perhaps, he theorized, it was an accumulation of sediment stirred up by a recent, uncharacteristic, and surprisingly violent desert downpour, or worse, some unfortunate desert creature, a pack rat, a wayward Gila monster, that had somehow managed to breach its defenses and meet its untimely end within its watery depths. It was a thoroughly unpleasant, physically demanding job he'd been deliberately, perhaps foolishly, dreading and postponing, but one that, with his water supply now completely cut off, could no longer be reasonably or comfortably delayed. Donning his oldest, paint-splattered work clothes, a pair of sturdy leather gloves, and a wide-brimmed straw hat to ward off the already fierce, punishing mid-morning sun, Mr. Finch retrieved a heavy, somewhat rickety aluminum extension ladder from his cluttered garden shed. He leaned it carefully against the sun-warmed corrugated side of the 10-foot-high, 8-foot-diameter metal tank. The circular access hatch on its slightly domed top was secured by a simple, somewhat rusted, but still functional, heavy-duty swivel latch. With a grunt of physical effort that belied his 70-odd years, he began his ascent, the metal rungs of the ladder surprisingly hot beneath his gloved hands. He reached the top, steadied himself, and with some effort worked the stiff, corroded latch free. With a low, protesting metallic groan, he pulled open the heavy circular steel lid, propping it carefully against the side of the tank. The first thing that assaulted him, that physically slammed into him with the force of a blow, was the smell. A putrid, gag-inducing, absolutely overpowering stench, thick, cloying, and unimaginably foul, billowed out from the dark, gaping opening, far worse, exponentially more offensive than any stagnant water, decaying algae, or even the most decomposed animal he had ever encountered in his long life. He recoiled violently, instinctively, nearly losing his footing on the narrow ladder, his gloved hand flying up to cover his nose and mouth, a useless gesture against such an overwhelming olfactory assault. His stomach churned rebelliously, threatening to disgrace him. Steeling himself with a supreme effort of will, his face grim, and driven by the pragmatic necessity of restoring his vital water supply, he peered cautiously, reluctantly, into the gloomy, shadowed interior of the massive tank. The water level, he noted with a detached part of his mind, was surprisingly low, perhaps only a third full. Its surface murky, opaque, and visibly disturbed, with patches of greasy, unidentifiable film. And then, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dimness, he saw it. Partially submerged in the foul, stagnant, shockingly cold-looking water, tangled in what initially looked like a haphazard collection of dark, shapeless debris, but on closer, horrified, heart-stopping inspection revealed itself to be items of sodden, waterlogged clothing, was a pale, indistinct, horribly misshapen form. It took a long, agonizing, disbelieving moment for his mind, reeling from the overpowering stench and the sheer, unthinkable unexpectedness of the sight, to process, to comprehend what his horrified eyes were beholding. It wasn't an animal, not any animal he could name. It wasn't a bundle of old rags or an accumulation of wind-blown desert sediment. It was, unmistakably, horrifyingly, sickeningly, a human body. Bloated, discolored, almost featureless from its prolonged immersion, but undeniably, irrevocably human. Mr. Alastair Finch let out a strangled, guttural cry, a raw sound of pure, unadulterated terror that was instantly swallowed by the vast, indifferent, sun-drenched silence of the surrounding desert sky. He scrambled, half fell, back down the ladder, his legs trembling so violently he nearly collapsed onto the dusty, unforgiving ground. His carefully cultivated, lifelong composure, his scholarly detachment, shattered into a million irretrievable pieces. His face was ashen, his neatly trimmed white beard quivering. He stumbled blindly into the cool, dim sanctuary of his small house, his breath coming in ragged, panicked, insufficient gasps, and fumbled with trembling, uncooperative fingers for the telephone receiver on the hall table. His shaking, palsied fingers barely managed to dial the 3 digits for emergency services.
The calm, professional voice of the dispatcher on the other end of the line struggled to understand his choked, hysterical, almost incoherent words, but the fragmented phrases, "water tank," "body," "my God, there's a body in my cistern," were chillingly, unmistakably, terrifyingly clear. Within minutes, the quiet, sun-baked solitude of Alastair Finch's dusty, unassuming street was shattered by the piercing, urgent wail of approaching sirens, a sound that heralded the horrifying, unthinkable, tragic intersection of his mundane domestic problem with the desperate, agonizing, month-long mystery of Havenwood's missing, much-loved young man. The jarring, insistent wail of sirens, growing rapidly closer, ripped through the pre-noon tranquility of Alastair Finch's normally placid neighborhood, drawing curious, then apprehensive, faces to windows and doorways along the dusty street. The arrival of Sheriff Roy Brody, his face grim and etched with a weary understanding, followed closely by two of his deputies, and then, shortly thereafter, by the county's ambulance and fire rescue teams, transformed Mr. Finch's sun-drenched, carefully tended property into a scene of grim, urgent official activity. The overpowering, fetid stench emanating from the now open rooftop cistern was a visceral, unavoidable confirmation of the horror contained within, a smell that clung to the hot, dry air and turned the stomachs of even the most seasoned emergency responders. Mr. Finch, visibly shaken, pale, and trembling uncontrollably, recounted his gruesome discovery in fragmented, disjointed sentences, his usual precise, almost pedantic diction lost entirely to the overwhelming shock and revulsion of his experience. The area immediately surrounding the massive water tank was quickly, efficiently cordoned off with stark, official yellow police tape, its bright, jarring color a brutal, almost surreal intrusion against the muted, natural desert hues of Finch's meticulously cultivated, drought-resistant garden.
Detective Maria Sanchez, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator whose reputation for tenacity had preceded her recent transfer to the county from a larger, more crime-ridden city precinct, arrived shortly thereafter. Her calm, methodical, almost unnervingly composed demeanor was a stark, almost jarring contrast to the palpable tension, disbelief, and thinly veiled revulsion that hung heavy and oppressive in the hot, stagnant air. She conferred briefly with Sheriff Brody, her keen, analytical eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The height and construction of the cistern, its accessibility, the proximity to neighboring properties, the distraught state of Mr. Finch. The first, grim, unavoidable task was the extraction of the body from its watery, makeshift tomb. It was a delicate, physically demanding, and profoundly unpleasant operation, performed with solemn precision by a specialized forensic recovery team dispatched from the state capital, their movements practiced, respectful, and efficient despite the horrific, challenging conditions. The local fire department was called upon to carefully drain a significant portion of the cistern's contents to facilitate the recovery. The foul water pumped into a containment unit for later forensic analysis. As the shrouded, waterlogged form was finally, carefully, almost reverently lifted from the dark, confining depths of the cistern and placed onto a waiting gurney, a wave of profound, collective sadness, mixed with a grim, unspoken foreboding, washed over the assembled officers and emergency personnel. Even before any official identification could be made, a terrible, unspoken, almost certain dread began to solidify in the hearts of those who knew of Ethan Vance's disappearance. The clothing, though severely discolored, waterlogged, and in the early stages of decay, bore a chilling resemblance to the description of what the young man had been wearing on the day he vanished from Weaver's Peak. A dark, faded band t-shirt, worn, familiar denim jeans, and a pair of distinctive, scuffed-up canvas sneakers. The devastating, heartbreaking confirmation came later that same evening from the county medical examiner's office, following a painstaking comparison with Ethan Vance's dental records, which had been on file since the initial missing persons report. The body recovered from Mr. Alastair Finch's rooftop water cistern was, indeed, tragically, unquestionably, that of 19-year-old Ethan Vance. The unbearable news was delivered to Carol and Mark Vance at their small home on Acacia Drive by Sheriff Brody and Detective Sanchez in person. They had chosen to go together, knowing the immense weight of the words they carried. The fragile, flickering ember of hope that the Vances had desperately, tenaciously clung to for 4 long, agonizing weeks was brutally, irrevocably, cruelly extinguished in that single, devastating moment, replaced by a grief so profound, so all-consuming, so utterly devastating, it seemed to suck the very air, the very life from their small, dimly lit living room. Carol Vance collapsed, a shattered, keening sound escaping her lips, into Mark's trembling arms. Her anguished, heartbroken sobs echoing the raw, unutterable primal pain of a mother who has lost her child in the most unimaginable, horrific, and senseless of circumstances. Mark, his face a stoic, unyielding mask that finally, catastrophically crumbled under the unbearable weight of his own crushing sorrow, could only hold her tightly, his own silent, scalding tears tracing unnoticed paths down his dust-streaked, grief-ravaged cheeks.
The forensic examination of Ethan's badly decomposed body and the careful analysis of the remaining contents of the cistern began immediately. A painstaking, meticulous process aimed at unearthing any clue, however minute, that might shed light on his final, terrifying hours. The preliminary autopsy report indicated that the official cause of death was drowning, but troubling, significant, and highly suspicious contusions and deeply indented abrasions were also found on his wrists and ankles. Injuries strongly suggestive that he might have been bound, his limbs tied, at some point prior to or during his entry into the water. However, no ligatures, no ropes or bindings of any kind were found either on the body itself or within the murky, sediment-filled depths of the tank. The exact time of death was incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to pinpoint with any degree of certainty, due to the body's prolonged immersion in water and the widely fluctuating extreme desert temperatures. But the medical examiner conservatively estimated that Ethan had been in the tank for at least 3 weeks, possibly closer to the full 4 weeks he had been missing, a time frame that, chillingly, precisely aligned with his disappearance. Key questions plagued Detective Sanchez. How had he gotten into a latched 10-foot-high water cistern on a private, fenced property located a significant distance from where he was last thought to be? Was he alive, conscious, and struggling when he went into that dark, confined, watery space? The disturbing lack of any significant defensive wounds on his hands or arms suggested he might have been incapacitated, unconscious, or perhaps even already deceased when he entered the tank. Detective Sanchez's investigation, as a matter of unavoidable routine and procedural necessity, immediately, though with professional empathy, focused on Alastair Finch. He was, after all, the owner of the property, the discoverer of the body. Mr. Finch, though clearly and profoundly traumatized by his gruesome discovery, his scholarly composure replaced by a persistent, agitated tremor in his hands, cooperated fully and unreservedly with the investigators. He had owned the property for 15 years, he explained, having purchased it upon his retirement. He had absolutely no connection whatsoever to the Vance family. Indeed, he wasn't even certain he would recognize them if he passed them on the street. He insisted, with a conviction that Sanchez found credible, that he hadn't physically inspected the interior of the large cistern for at least 2 years, possibly longer. Its heavy steel lid always kept securely latched, as per local recommendations, to prevent animals, birds, and wind-blown desert debris from contaminating the precious water supply. The latch, though old and somewhat rusted, was fully functional. It could be easily opened from the outside by anyone with a modicum of strength, but it would require a deliberate, conscious act. There were no signs of forced entry to the cistern itself, no pry marks, no damage to the latch or lid. Nor were there any overt signs of forced entry to Mr. Finch's property, which was partially enclosed by a low, somewhat dilapidated chain-link fence, but easily accessible from a dusty, unpaved rear alleyway that ran behind the houses on his block.
The crucial, baffling, almost insurmountable question that now lay at the dark heart of Detective Sanchez's investigation was that of accessibility and the sheer, audacious logistics of the crime. How could Ethan Vance, or his lifeless body, have been placed inside that tall, seemingly secure tank without anyone in the quiet, observant neighborhood seeing or hearing anything remotely suspicious or out of the ordinary? The cistern, while positioned at the rear of Mr. Finch's property, was nevertheless clearly visible from his kitchen window and from certain angles of the properties of his immediate neighbors to the north and south, though its lower portion was partially, seasonally obscured by a large, unruly oleander bush that Mr. Finch had, with some regret, allowed to grow a little too wild. Had the perpetrator or perpetrators acted under the deep, concealing cover of a moonless desert night? Did they possess an intimate, perhaps even chilling knowledge of Mr. Finch's routines, his comings and goings? Or was this a horrific, impulsive crime of opportunity, a sudden, violent encounter that had escalated with terrifying speed, leading to a desperate, almost panicked, yet strangely effective disposal of the evidence? The questions mounted relentlessly, each one leading Detective Maria Sanchez deeper into a disturbing, complex, and profoundly unsettling mystery. The focus of the case had shifted with brutal finality from if Ethan Vance was the victim of foul play to the terrifying, almost unimaginable specifics of how such a monstrous, almost unthinkable thing could have happened, and the even more chilling, pressing question of who among them was capable of such a monstrous, inhuman act in the quiet, sun-baked, seemingly peaceful streets of Havenwood. The weeks following the horrifying discovery of Ethan Vance's body in Alastair Finch's rooftop water cistern were a blur of intense, often frustrating, and increasingly disheartening investigative activity for Detective Maria Sanchez and her small, dedicated team. They meticulously, systematically canvassed Mr. Finch's entire neighborhood, re-interviewing residents who had already been spoken to during the initial missing persons phase, patiently probing for any newly recalled detail, however trivial or insignificant it might have seemed at the time. They searched for anyone who might have seen or heard anything remotely unusual around the time Ethan disappeared. A strange, unfamiliar vehicle parked on their street, unfamiliar individuals walking in the area, unaccounted for noises or disturbances in the dead of night, lights on at unusual hours in normally dark houses. But Havenwood, particularly in its older, more established sections like Mr. Finch's, was a town where people, while generally neighborly in a crisis, also valued their privacy and largely kept to themselves. Their routines often dictated by the rising and setting of the relentless desert sun. The desert nights were vast, profoundly silent, capable of swallowing secrets and even screams, whole and without a trace. No credible, actionable witnesses emerged from the exhaustive canvassing. The forensic team, with painstaking, almost microscopic care, drained and thoroughly searched the cavernous cistern, sifting through the thick, noxious sludge that had accumulated at its bottom over years of use. They found a handful of corroded, unidentifiable pennies, a child's lost, faded plastic toy soldier from a bygone era, a bird skeleton, but absolutely nothing that shed any discernible light on Ethan Vance's final, terrifying moments or the identity of his killer. No discarded murder weapon, no remnants of ligatures or bindings, no definitive, usable trace evidence, such as foreign hairs or fibers, that could conclusively link another individual to the scene of that horrific watery entombment. The ambiguous abrasions found on Ethan's wrists and ankles remained a troubling, deeply frustrating, and ultimately inconclusive clue. They could have been caused by restraints applied by an assailant, or, perhaps with equal plausibility, by desperate, futile, agonizing thrashing against the rough, unyielding interior of the metal tank if he had been alive, however briefly, conscious and aware of his horrifying predicament when he entered the water.
The lack of definitive, irrefutable answers from the final autopsy report regarding his precise state of consciousness upon entering the tank, or the exact sequence of events leading to his death, only deepened the already profound and unsettling mystery. Detective Sanchez, a pragmatic investigator not prone to wild speculation, nevertheless explored numerous, increasingly desperate theories. Was Ethan somehow lured to Mr. Alastair Finch's property under some elaborate false pretext? Highly unlikely, as exhaustive checks confirmed he had absolutely no known connection to Finch or that specific, somewhat remote neighborhood on the western edge of town. Was he abducted from Weaver's Peak, or perhaps from somewhere else entirely, his movements after leaving his home a complete unknown, and then his body, later, chillingly, disposed of in the conveniently accessible yet horrifyingly public cistern? This scenario seemed more plausible, suggesting a perpetrator or perpetrators with access to a vehicle capable of transporting a body, a disturbing knowledge of Havenwood's less trafficked areas and residential vulnerabilities, and a chilling, almost psychopathic degree of premeditation and cold-blooded nerve. But who possessed such characteristics in a town like Havenwood? Ethan's immediate circle of friends and acquaintances was re-examined with a new, far more critical and suspicious eye. Were there any hidden, festering rivalries, unspoken jealousies, or dangerous, clandestine drug-related issues that hadn't surfaced during the initial, more benign missing persons investigation? His best friend, Jake Riley, thoroughly devastated by Ethan's horrific death and the manner of its discovery, cooperated fully and unreservedly with Detective Sanchez, but could offer no concrete insight into any serious troubles Ethan might have been concealing. "He was stressed about getting his art school applications in on time, man," Jake told Sanchez, his voice raw and choked with grief, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. "And yeah, he was broke, like always. But he wasn't into anything heavy, nothing like this. He just wanted to make his art, maybe get out of Havenwood for a while. Someone did this to him, Detective. Someone evil."
The investigation hit one frustrating, unyielding roadblock after another. The water cistern, while its heavy lid was routinely latched by Mr. Finch, wasn't secured by a padlock or any other serious deterrent. A determined, reasonably strong individual could certainly have accessed it, but it remained a 10-foot-high, smooth-sided tank. Getting an incapacitated, struggling, or already deceased adult male body up and into the relatively narrow, circular top hatch would have been an incredibly awkward, physically demanding, and highly risky undertaking, almost certainly requiring more than one person, or at the very least, someone exceptionally strong, agile, and operating with a terrifying, almost inhuman coolness under the immense, prolonged risk of discovery. Yet, frustratingly, there was absolutely no discernible evidence of a struggle around the base of the tank. No disturbed earth, no scuff marks on the metal, no dropped items, and no clear, identifiable footprints preserved in the hard-baked, unforgiving desert soil that didn't belong to Mr. Finch, the initial responding officers, or the subsequent forensic recovery team. The impact on Ethan Vance's family was beyond devastating. Their initial agonizing grief from his disappearance, now hideously compounded by the horrific, almost gothic circumstances of his death and the continued agonizing lack of answers or justice. Carol Vance retreated almost entirely into a shell of profound, inconsolable sorrow, rarely leaving the dim confines of her house. The vibrant, energetic woman her friends and family knew, slowly fading into a pale, haunted shadow of her former self. Mark Vance, outwardly stoic, tried to maintain a semblance of strength for both of them, but the effort visibly drained him, his face aging years in a matter of weeks, his shoulders perpetually slumped under an invisible, crushing weight. The funeral for Ethan was a somber, heartbreaking affair, the small Havenwood community church overflowing with mourners,
the entire town seemingly turning out to pay their last respects, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of shared sorrow, communal fear, and a disquieting, uncomfortable awareness of the insidious darkness that had so clearly, brutally surfaced in their supposedly safe, close-knit midst. For Alastair Finch, the gruesome discovery transformed his carefully constructed, peaceful retirement into a waking, recurring nightmare. His home, once his quiet, intellectual sanctuary, now felt irredeemably tainted, violated by an unimaginable horror. He put it up for sale shortly after the primary police investigation allowed, unable to bear the constant, grim visual reminder of what had lain hidden within his yard. He moved to a small, anonymous apartment in a distant city, seeking an escape that he knew, deep down, would likely always elude him. The water cistern itself became a macabre, unspoken landmark in Havenwood, a subject of morbid local curiosity, hushed, fearful speculation, and a source of chilling ghost stories among the town's teenagers.
Months later, despite Detective Maria Sanchez's relentless, unwavering efforts and her refusal to officially classify the case as cold, the brutal, baffling death of Ethan Vance remained stubbornly, maddeningly, heartbreakingly unsolved. Theories ranging from a drug deal gone fatally wrong with out-of-town criminals to a chance, violent encounter with a predatory transient, or even, more disturbingly, a carefully planned act by someone known to Ethan, someone living amongst them in Havenwood, continued to abound within the Havenwood Sheriff's Department and among the frightened, bewildered townsfolk. But theories, however plausible or sensational, were not evidence, and hard, actionable evidence was in critically, fatally short supply. The identity of the person or persons who had so cruelly ended Ethan Vance's young life, and then, with such chilling audacity, placed him in that dark, watery tomb, and the unfathomable reasons behind their monstrous, inhuman act, remained shrouded in the impenetrable, suffocating darkness of the unknown. The water cistern on Mr. Finch's former property, eventually drained, professionally cleaned, and then permanently, irrevocably sealed by official town order, stood as a silent, grim, unavoidable monument to a vibrant young life tragically, senselessly cut short, and to the unsettling, deeply disturbing truth that sometimes, even in a small, sun-drenched desert town where everyone supposedly knew everyone else's business, evil could strike with devastating, incomprehensible precision, leaving behind only a legacy of unanswered questions, shattered lives, and the profoundly unsettled, murky depths of an enduring, chilling, and deeply personal mystery. Detective Sanchez kept Ethan Vance's thick, frustrating file open and prominent on her desk, a constant, tangible reminder of a puzzle she was fiercely determined, however long it ultimately took, to one day, somehow, solve. But the desert, she knew with a growing, weary certainty, was very, very good at keeping its darkest, most terrible secrets.